From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk radio network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. The man that introduced online communications to America, the founder of AOL, and who then survived the spectacular failure of the AOL-Time Warner merger, he looks back and looks forward, sharing his vision for the next technological revolution. That's all today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Steve Case was the founder of America Online. He's currently CEO of Revolution LLC. At its peak, AOL handled 50% of all Internet traffic, was the first Internet IPO and the top-performing company of the 1990s, as well as the creator of the ubiquitous virtual phrase, "You've got mail." Steve's fascinating new and visionary book is The Third Wave, an entrepreneur's vision of the future. Welcome, Steve. Honor to have you.
Great to be with you, Jim.
It's hard for me to remember, but you were at one time AOL, Google, Twitter, Facebook, all wrapped in one, right?
Yeah, no, it was at our peak. It was great. As you said, it was about half of all the Internet traffic, and it was really, for most people, the way they got online and where they spent most of their time online. And that really was the whole first wave of the Internet. Kind of when we started in 1985, so 31 years ago, only 3% of people were online, and they were only online 1 hour a week, believe it or not. And so that whole first wave was just building the Internet, building the on-ramps to the Internet, getting everybody connected to the Internet, and taking it from an idea that most people didn't know about or care about, by the end of that first wave around the year 2000, everybody was connected, and it really had changed their lives and changed the world.
Yeah, you guys were the first tech IPO worth $70 million valuation. 8 years later, you were $160 billion, which is amazing. But it was really David versus Goliath. I started at IBM out of business school and saw from the side a little of Prodigy, their effort.
Oh, sure.
And I got to see some of their presentations. But there was GE and Genie, there was MSN, there was CompuServe and all that. IBM alone had technology. Sears bought retail. CBS bought ads. So on paper, they should have killed you. But you had this insight that it wasn't content and commerce initially, it was instant message and communicating. How did you beat the big guys?
Yeah, no, we were scared of some of those players. As you mentioned, the Prodigy joint venture, they spent $1 billion, IBM and Sears, and for a while CBS as well. GE, as you say, also was a big player, Knight Ridder, AT&T. You kind of go down the list of some pretty gigantic companies that were focused on this, 3 decades ago. We were able to build a team. We only in our first round in 1985 raised just $1 million of venture capital, so we had to do it differently, and we did it through partnerships with a lot of PC manufacturers for the first few years, and then we were able to kind of launch America Online as our own brand. But as you say, we for us the big bet was partly partners, but also partly that the killer app of the Internet was going to be people. It was going to be community. It was going to be connecting people through things like chat rooms, what we called people connection, or creating things like instant messaging and buddy lists, and that really was a differentiator for us. As you say, some of the other players like Sears thought it would be mostly about commerce, and Knight Ridder thought it'd be mostly about content, and AT&T thought it'd be mostly about connectivity. We thought it was mostly about community, and that turned out to be the right bet because over half of our traffic was always these community functions, even to this day with Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, which are basically, we now call it social media, not community, but they are the leaders of the pack, which shows that the power of the idea of people connecting through this new medium.
When I saw the presentation you used to give, the model looked unbelievable. It was going to be a 70% margin beyond the break-even point, but they never seemed to get the break-even point. They kept working it out. And then Larry Tisch bought CBS, and he thought this thing was a boondoggle. He pulled the plug on it, and IBM and Sears were so mad they cut advertising on the network more than Larry had cut, so that it was like kids fighting each other.
Right. Now, sometimes that's why watching that was an important lesson for me, because sometimes these big companies, even though they do have these kind of big kind of Goliath-like resources, just can't get the right people focused on the right priorities, working together in the right kind of way. And frankly, sadly, I saw that when we did merge AOL and Time Warner, and opportunity for those two companies working together to drive some initiatives around digital music or communication services was terrific, but just had trouble executing, and ultimately that does come down to to people. So I think that is a lesson I learned. I think as we think about this next third wave, I think it's going to be really important that the big companies figure out ways to partner with the small companies and not just try to do everything internally themselves, because that generally is a difficult path.
In fact, we're going to look back now and look forward quickly in this first segment. Looking back, this merger ended up with Time Warner destroying about $200 billion of value. From my perspective, knowing nothing of what was going on the inside, I would have had to say, what were you thinking? Did you really expect that this was going to be able to work together?
Yeah, I did. In retrospect, I was wrong, but I did, because Time Warner really was built by a series of entrepreneurs in terms of the early days of Time Inc. or with Henry Luce and Ted Turner with Turner Broadcasting and the Warner brothers created the entertainment side of things. So I really believe that we could get back to those entrepreneurial roots. I really believe that AOL needed the path the broadband Time Warner had. Time Warner needed the path a digital future that AOL had. But as I said, and I quote in the book, Thomas Edison over 100 years ago said, "Vision without execution is hallucination." And that's why I'd summarize the merger. The idea of the merger, strategically made sense, but the execution just wasn't there.
Were you blinded a little bit about worrying about the internet mania blowing up before you guys got out?
Sure, there is a little bit of that. We had gone from, as you said, a $70 million valuation in 1992 to 8 years later, $160 billion. And we had about $5 billion of revenue, $1 billion of profit. So the multiples were certainly high by any historical measure. So there's some risk we thought there, and having merging with a company that had significant assets and significant profits and a diverse mix of businesses, we thought would be a good hedge. But actually, the other reason we did it was the strategic path, where it really did feel like we needed a clearer path to broadband, and Time Warner owned the largest cable system, and they believed they needed a clearer path to the internet, and we were able to provide that. In theory, we were able to provide that path. So the logic of the merger, to me, made sense for a host of reasons, but again, it's not just about the idea, it's about the execution.
All right, now we'll look forward in the remaining of our first segment here. Talk briefly, you've described the first wave. What do you mean by the second wave? And then, of course, tell us what this revolution is that you're calling for.
Well, as I said, the first wave is just building the Internet. The second wave has been the last 15 years or so, and it's really been building on top of the Internet, building apps and services on top of the Internet. So it's things like Google and Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and Waze and things that people use. And the first wave was mostly about the PC. The second wave has increasingly been about phones, smartphones in particular. And that's going to then unleash this third wave, which is now beginning to build head of steam, which it moves from kind of apps on phones to integrating the Internet in seamless and pervasive, sometimes even invisible ways, throughout our lives. In the process, have the opportunity to really transform our cities, a whole focus on things called smart cities, transform healthcare. There's ways to use technology to create more personalized approaches to staying healthy and getting well when you get sick, and more precision medicine around things like cancer, revolutionize learning and classrooms. The way most teachers teach and the way most kids learn is still the way it was 10, 20 years ago. But even though we know kids learn differently, and having more personalized, adaptive approaches to learning so they can learn at their own pace, sometimes more visually, for example, I think is going to be a big deal. There's some big parts of our lives that although we saw a lot of innovation in the first and second wave, some of the most important aspects of our lives haven't changed that much, but they will in the third wave. But it's going to require a different mindset and a different playbook, which is why I decided to write the book.
Do you see the Internet becoming like a utility, like electricity or something, and which is a commodity? But is that bad then for the value-added nature of tech?
I've always said that eventually the Internet will be so embedded in our lives we kind of take it for granted. Like you mentioned, electricity. 100 years ago, that was sort of this newfangled technology. Now we kind of take it for granted. And it's still important, but it's more integrated. And I think eventually we'll even walk away from what's now still a hyphenated Internet. We talk about email. Someday we'll just talk about mail. We talk about e-commerce. Someday we'll just talk about commerce. So I think that's just the march of innovation, and the Internet going from a fringy idea at the beginning of that first wave to now being pretty central and over time becoming more and more integrated and really in the process change things. And some of the interesting things in this third wave, I mentioned the first wave was about PCs, the second wave was about phones. The third wave is going to be about other devices, including sensors and and things that get embedded in our cars or embedded in our streets, or just different ways to better manage traffic and better manage energy and things like that. So there's some big positives that can come in this third wave, but it's going to require more partnerships with the entrepreneurs and the big companies, and also more understanding of policy, because many of these sectors are regulated, and that was not the case so much in the second wave.
Looking at your own passion, you started your first business at 10 years old. You started 6 when you were at Williams College. Is this an innate thing, do you think, entrepreneurship?
Certainly was for me, and I was just looking for the right opportunity. But I also do meet some people who are, in their 50s, 60s that become entrepreneurs. Ray Kroc, who basically started McDonald's, was in his 50s when he had that, kind of insight and bought one store, McDonald's, and turned into a global chain. I think there is something for some people where early on they know they're entrepreneurs, but there are people that kind of find themselves in an entrepreneurial path kind of later in life.
Listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 affiliated stations around the country. You can go to biztalkradio.com to find the station closest to you to listen over the Internet or access our podcasts. We'll be right back. And our guest, the man responsible for You've Got Mail, Steve Case. One thing that surprised me, as we look a little bit back deeper before we go forward deeper, the Internet was not even commercialized until 1992. The famous Al Gore invented the Internet. It was actually a DoD application, right?
Yeah, I think Al Gore kind of said something that got a little misinterpreted there. He actually did play a role in the Telecom Act that commercialized the Internet. But as you say, the core Internet technologies really were funded by the U.S. government by funding a project at an agency called DARPA that basically built the infrastructure of the Internet. And then there are a couple of decisions the government made that really then let it take off. One was a judicial decision where a Judge Green, in the early 80s, broke up Ma Bell, the big phone company, and created these regional Bell operating companies and unleashed a torrent of innovation in telecommunications. There were suddenly thousands of companies doing it, not just one, and that's why prices kind of plummeted and the cost of access plummeted as well. When we first launched AOL 31 years ago, on average, it cost about $10 per hour to be connected, and we were able to get it down to pennies an hour. And so it really kind of was a game changer in terms of making consumer services more affordable. But the last point, as you mentioned, when we started in 1985, it was actually illegal for businesses or consumers to connect to the Internet, because back then the Internet was restricted to use by government institutions and educational institutions. So if you worked on a university campus, you could connect to the Internet, but if you were at home or at an office, you couldn't. That changed with that Telecom Act that Congress passed. You started out at Procter & Gamble and Pizza Hut, classic brand management outfits. So I ask 2 questions. One, you think it's smart for folks to start on other people's money, look at a big corporate before you go out on your own? And second, did you consider yourself a techie or a marketer? Well, on the second, I consider myself more of a marketer than a techie, but it's partly just trying to understand where trends are going and try to position yourself. Like Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player. People say he was great because he didn't focus on where the puck was; he focused on where the puck's going. So for me, that's the key skill. It requires a certain creativity and a certain ability to connect the dots and see some patterns and just kind of get in front of the parade. So that's my kind of bias. In terms of coming out of college, actually in 1980, I actually read a book also called The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler that really was for me very inspirational, kind of mesmerizing. And so if in 1980 I could have gone directly to an internet company, I would have, but there were no internet companies in 1980. And there wasn't, frankly, much of a startup culture back in 1980. So that's why I went to work for a couple big companies, Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, and then PepsiCo, which owned Pizza Hut at the time, which was based in Wichita, Kansas. So I learned. I was only at P&G 2 years and then Pizza Hut 1 year, so I wasn't there that long. But I learned some important things and did have a better sense of how larger companies think and operate. I think that ended up being helpful to me. But I do also run into a lot of people now graduating from schools and wanting to jump right into the startup scene, and sometimes that is the better path for them. So it doesn't require going to a larger company, but for me it worked out well.
I got to ask this because I lived through all this. Where did you get the idea to send out all those free discs, which I got to laugh, by the end they were offering like 700 free hours.
Yeah, we were pretty aggressive there. In retrospect, I think we went too far when we started bundling our free trial discs with frozen Omaha steaks. That might have been a little
I just came back from Omaha and Berkshire.
A bridge too far. That might have been a little too much. But no, we tested it very, very carefully, and we were tracking each disc and knew what the response rate was, and we had a certain model in terms of how much we're willing to spend to attract customers, and it worked pretty well. But in terms of the inspiration of the idea, actually some of that comes from my my brief stint at Procter & Gamble, because when they launched products, a new shampoo or something, they used samples as a way to do that. They'd put a little packet of the shampoo in your newspaper or send it to you by mail, and that was a way to get people to try things. So when we were starting AOL, we were looking for ways to get more people on the Internet, more people willing to take the plunge, because at the time the Internet was viewed as sort of this, kind of hobbyist thing, kind of this techie thing. We wanted to be much more of a mainstream thing, and the free trial disc were a key part of that.
And we talked about the big guys and hardball, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about Bill Gates brought you in to talk about maybe trying to buy you.
Yeah, in the 90s, we'd gone public in 92, and 93, 94, Microsoft was starting to look at this market and decided the Internet was important and was thinking about building something themselves, but actually made it clear that their preference would be to acquire AOL. So we kind of had some conversation. They did go to Seattle to meet with Bill Gates in his office, and he basically did say we would like to, we respect what you guys are doing, and rather than kind of create our own thing that's going to compete with you, we'd rather figure out a way to align with you, either make a big investment to own part of your company or preferably buy all of your company. And it was a little scary because Microsoft was kind of a giant then. Windows operating system was sort of the monopoly. Everybody was using it, so the idea that they could integrate their online service with their operating system and have essentially no marketing cost and ubiquity was pretty scary. But ultimately, we decided to turn their offer down, and good thing we did, because at the time we were worth less than $1 billion, and 5-6 years later it was $160 billion. So we were glad we passed on that offer. But it was a little scary time for a little while.
I think also that he sort of inferred if you didn't sell out, you might get stomped on by the
elephant. It was pretty aggressive, a little intimidating.
Not too subtle.
I think at the time I was just 31, 32, something like that. It was a little scary, but thankfully we stayed the course.
It certainly worked out. Let's look at just a couple of the mistakes in the AOL Time Warner. Looking back, first off, why did you, before you even started, offer to step down when you were negotiating with Gerald Levin? It didn't even sound like that's a good negotiating tactic, that you might have hung on to that a little bit.
No, I actually concluded that from an AOL shareholder perspective, the merger did make a lot of sense, and that we, in order to get the merger done and to get Time Warner to support it and get Jerry Levin, who was the CEO of Time Warner at the time, to be comfortable with it, I concluded, and after talking with our team and our outside advisors, investment bankers, and others, that that getting them to agree to the merger was likely to be hard, but it was going to be impossible unless I agreed to let Jerry Levin, who was the CEO of Time Warner at the time, kind of lead the combined company. So that's why if I had called him and said, let's talk about a merger, I think he would have said, not interested. So I deliberately called and said, I'd like to talk about a merger, and just to be clear, if we do merge, I'll step aside as CEO so you can run the combined company, which was interesting enough for him to at least have a meeting to talk about it. Did the fact that you took the chairman's position but didn't have a line of businesses reporting to even AOL, do you regret that? I think it could have been different if I had been more involved, but I can't say I regret it, because I did conclude, again, my job as CEO of AOL was to try to kind of do a merger that would kind of protect some of the downside and also unleash some of the upside. And I felt that was the right call, and I had to put my own personal kind of interests aside and do what I thought was best for the shareholders, and that was stepping aside, not having any kind of operating responsibilities, including overseeing AOL. As we get down to the last minute, two things. You could have bought Apple then. I want to get your thoughts on that. And secondly, is there somebody in retrospect that would have been a better fit to merge with? We looked at a lot of things. I talk about in the book some of the things about whether we should merge with AT&T or Disney or eBay or a bunch of different options we were looking at. But at the end of the day, because of the importance of broadband, remember we were the leader of narrowband when it was still those dial-up modems. We didn't really have a position in the broadband in cable systems, and Time Warner owned the largest cable system. So we thought that was strategically very important, almost an imperative. And we also believed that the mix of business they had and the profits they had would be right. So even if I look back, and I do in the book lay out the pluses and minuses of different options, I think Time Warner was the right option strategically. But again, I'm first to admit it didn't work the way we expected, and so the execution of that idea, the execution of that vision was flawed, and that's why I took away the lesson around people and culture, which I think is going to be critically important for people thinking about innovation in this upcoming third wave. And that's exactly where we're heading, the coming third wave tech revolution.
We're talking with Steve Case. He's the author of a new book, The Third Wave, An Entrepreneur's Vision of the Future, and it's kind of a reimagining of life. It's big stuff. But it's interesting because we've just come out of an era where, a guy writes an app, it goes viral, and he makes a ton of money. And you're now talking about things like partnerships, policy, which will turn off a lot of people, and perseverance. Talk about what this is going to look like differently.
Yeah, I recognize when I talk about the book I call the 3 Ps. For some, it's sort of a little bit of a turn-off, kind of a bummer that that it's going to be harder to build companies in the third wave. It's going to require more perseverance. There are going to be fewer overnight successes. It's going to be more like AOL was, sort of a 10-year in the making overnight success. And perseverance is going to be important. Partnerships is going to be important. I think in the third wave, whether you're focused on health or learning or food or energy or transportation, it's generally going to require partnering. And that's hard. You have to figure out which companies to partner with and how to build relationships of trust and how to figure out ways to strike kind of win-win deals that make both companies happy. So partnerships and the skill around partnerships can become more important in this third wave. And also, as you say, policy is going to become more important. Most of these sectors are regulated, and while we can debate about what regulations should exist or how they should get changed, the reality is things around drug safety or food safety or how driverless cars work on our roads or drones work in our skies. There's going to be some regulations associated with them, and so the innovators just need to understand that. It's not just about the app like it was in the second wave. It really is much more fundamental, much more integrated, and so these 3 Ps around perseverance and partnerships and policy are going to become more important. But one of the points I make in the book, indeed one of the reasons I wrote the book, is while those 3 Ps weren't that important in the second wave, when it was more about software, was more about apps, they were very important in the first wave. We had to persevere at AOL. We had to establish partnerships at AOL. We had to engage with government policy at AOL, and other companies in the first wave did as well. So it's partly the third wave is going to look like the first wave. As Shakespeare said, sometimes the past is prologue, and so I wanted to write a book about the future, provide sort of a roadmap for the future, but it's informed by some of the stories, some of the lessons learned in the past.
You definitely show you can look around the corner. Unlike most Silicon Valley guys, you don't seem to be afraid of Washington, D.C. or turned off, and part of it may be because you guys were in Virginia. But those barriers to entry here are maybe less technology than bureaucracy or having to compromise or the slower-moving nature of the regulatory beast.
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm a big fan of government involvement or a big fan of dealing with regulations. It can be a hassle and it can be a obstruction and can slow things down. So I'm just more saying tough luck if you're really going to try to impact such fundamental aspects of our lives, such as our healthcare system. There's going to be regulations involved in that, and if you're going to try to figure out ways to be part of this movement around smart cities with sensors and autonomous cars and things like that, there's going to be regulations on that. So just have to understand that and embrace that as just part of the doing business as an innovator in the third wave. And I think that dynamic is going to become more important. And that the reason to kind of lay out that framework is to just try to kind of make sure people recognize it. It's a kind of a game changer in terms of what's going to happen next. That's true whether you're a small company, kind of an entrepreneur in a startup, or a big company, because in this third wave, the aspect of partnerships is going to become more important, and the innovators who can dance with other folks are going to be the big winners.
In fact, I'm going to reimagine a little bit now to give people a perspective of how big this stuff is. If we take healthcare, for instance, right now it's high cost. We don't necessarily have better long-term results than other countries. It's not preventative-oriented. How can sort of big data and reimagining healthcare come out of this third wave?
As you say, it's a critical part of our lives. It's a big sector of our economy. It's about 1/6 of our overall economy is our healthcare system. And there's, the way I look at it, there's really 3 parts to it. The sector around keeping us well, what some call wellness, and there's interesting things happening there around wearable devices like Fitbit and things like that, and there'll be more of that coming forward. The second is dealing with chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, and we're beginning to see some real innovation there. And the third is dealing with more life-threatening disease, things like cancer, where we need more of an approach that's around kind of precision medicine. Right now, MD Anderson, a cancer hospital in Texas, says when people come there for second opinions, 25% of the time they reverse the first opinion. 25% of the time the first opinion was just wrong. And in most cases, it was wrong because they didn't have the right data. They didn't have the right insights, so they just it was a misdiagnosis. And we also have a huge problem in our hospitals around errors in terms of delivery of care. So I do think in this third wave, we are going to be able to have a healthcare system where there's better outcomes with greater convenience at lower cost. But it's going to require this different mindset that I lay out in the book where partnerships, policy, perseverance are front and center.
And I still don't believe if I got this right or not. There's a number in there that potentially the better outcomes could yield $1 trillion a year of savings and better results in healthcare. And that just seems mind-boggling.
Yeah, no, it's a huge sector, and then there's a lot of things that are good about it, but there are also a lot of things that are ripe for improvement.
Now, one of the huge challenges in this country is education, particularly K through 12 public education. Is there a way to do some leapfrogging here and get around some of the barriers?
Yeah, again, it's a challenge, and it's not just about the app. It's about how you kind of work with teachers, work with professors, work with schools, work with universities. But there's evidence in a number of cities that there are interesting models around more personalized, adaptive learning systems, and as they become more prevalent, I think that's going to usher in a kind of new era around learning on campus. Of course, there are going to be opportunities to learn on the internet, whether it be the Khan Academy or other kinds of services. But I think it's still, for most people, most of the learning is going to happen in a classroom. And how do we give the teachers the tools they need to really customize learning? Because frankly, different kids learn differently, and some just need more time. Some people are more visual learners, so we can't adopt a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to education. It has to be more customized and personalized, and technology can help do that.
And going from educational inequality is a challenge. Another big issue is income inequality. And I thought it was really exciting. You talked about what you call the rise of the rest. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think there's great innovation happening in places like Silicon Valley, obviously, and New York City and Boston. But there's also great innovation happening all over the country, and that part of the story is not as well told. And I think that's going to accelerate what I call this rise of the rest, accelerate in this third wave over the next 10 or 20 years. And that's going to really lift up a lot of communities around the country that feel a little left out in the second wave. But it seems like all the action is in Silicon Valley. Most of the capital is focused on Silicon Valley, we visited now a couple dozen cities on these Rise of the Rest bus tours I do, kind of a road trip. Cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh and Nashville and Charleston and Madison and Minneapolis and Kansas City and St. Louis and Des Moines, great American cities that are showing real signs of building vibrant startup communities, which are really going to create more jobs and economic growth and opportunity in those cities. So I think in this third wave we're going to have innovation more dispersed all across the country, and entrepreneurs have the ability to attract talent and capital and attention all across the country. And so we're not going to just have all our eggs in a few baskets. Last year, for example, 75% of venture capital went to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. And in the third wave, I think that's going to change, and the other 47 states are going to get more capital, and that's going to help more entrepreneurs in more places do more things, and in the process create more jobs that really lift up those communities and give people more of a sense of hope and possibility.
On basic research now, a lot of people don't know that I think it came out of DARPA, but somewhere GPS, for instance, came out of the military.
Yeah.
The NIH is sort of starved. Do you see what we have to do, or are you optimistic about leveraging basic research?
I'm optimistic, but I think we need to take a fresh look at what the right level of funding is. We have been cutting funding, and obviously there are a lot of challenges we have in the country and deficits and other things, and we have to be smart about where we invest. But I would say one of the places we should invest more is in basic research, because as you said, that basic research did create the internet. That basic research did create the GPS technology that we take for granted in our phones and in our cars. That data, that investment did create the weather service and all the weather tracking that we now, when we watch TV or look at our phones or tablets or PCs for weather reports, that's actually coming from data provided by the government because of some of that basic research investment. And most of the breakthrough drugs have come through some initial investment in the government. Even Google was started with a grant from the government in terms of how to better kind of do search algorithms. So we need to make sure we win what's now a global battle for entrepreneurship, and other countries are stepping up their investment in research, they're stepping up their investment incentives, they're stepping up their fight for talent in terms of immigration policies to attract talent. And so if we're going to remain the most innovative entrepreneur nation, we need to step up our efforts as well, and that's one of the things I call for in the book. It's sort of the chapter on the risk of America getting disrupted. And there's a little bit of a manifesto of some of the steps I think we need to take to keep our lead as such an entrepreneurial nation.
Obviously, you revolutionized the world once. Your equity firm is now called Revolution. Do you feel the need to have another big, huge thing, or you're more interested in seeding?
Well, I think we think Revolution can be a big, huge thing, but then we're building it up in a variety of different ways, particularly focused on these third-wave entrepreneurs in these rise of the rest cities. But I don't have a particular interest in starting another company. I really want to. Right now, we've invested nearly 100 companies all around the country, and I really want to be a champion for a lot of different entrepreneurs, a mentor, and help them take their ideas and change the world.
Challenges to the coming third-wave revolution in our final national segment. Our guest, Revolution LLC CEO Steve Case. The election's on right now, and I was actually intrigued. You've got a lot of innovative ideas here that, of course, are not being talked about in the election. We've got an outdated regulatory structure. I want to get some of your ideas there, but let's start off with, you talk about the government having 22 cabinet agencies reporting to the president, and that's nonsensical in a kind of a corporate span of control. Talk about your ideas there.
They've been talked about for decades. I think even President Nixon suggested kind of shrinking the cabinet, having fewer people, and having each of them more empowered so that they can really run their operations. And the resistance there was usually from Congress, which kind of likes the oversight authority. And so I understand that dynamic, but I think we do need to take a fresh look at how do we essentially reboot our government so it is more flexible, is more agile, it can get more things done in a smarter kind of way. And a lot of things have changed in the last few decades because of technology, because of the internet. A lot of things more will change in this third wave. We need to make sure our government changes as well and recognizes that the government structures we put in place a half a century ago are a little creaky and sometimes not as effective as they need to be.
And, in fact, very interesting idea of having the vice president maybe serve as the chief operating officer and keep the president as sort of a strategic CEO. How do we cut across all the silos? Is this U.S. digital service you talk about, is that kind of the answer?
It's a great example. I think an experiment that's showing real promise. It just started a few years ago, and basically the idea is, right now just a few hundred people who left companies like Google and Twitter and Facebook and others, innovative companies, and said they'll basically do a tour of duty for a few years working for the government because they want to help their country. And they've taken on some projects that the initial approach the government had around its healthcare.gov site was kind of this large, gargantuan bureaucratic effort that didn't really work very well, cost a lot of money, took forever, and didn't really work very well. And the smaller, scrappier team they had at 18F is sort of more this digital, stealthy startup within the government. In a few months was able to create a much better site. And so bringing that mentality of the kind of this entrepreneurial innovation mindset, I think the government is important. There are many aspects of the government that can be improved, need to be improved, and I think getting more innovators who are willing to serve their country. Maybe they aren't willing to do that forever, but maybe they'll do a tour of duty for 2, 3, 4 years. So this U.S. digital service is a great example of an initiative that hopefully will continue to grow in its importance over the coming years.
I'd kind of like to get your opinion on whether these things work or not. President Obama had his Council on Jobs and Competitiveness that Jeff Immelt of GE chaired. You were chairman of the Subcommittee on Entrepreneurship. There's some other Startup America partnerships. You went to school with President Obama. My cousin went to Punahou, too, which is, I think,
great.
I think that's the school you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Do those work, and have they produced?
People are skeptical about those things. In the case of the Jobs Council, I think Jeff Immelt did a great job kind of doing something in a pretty nonpartisan way, which is I was supportive. I stay out of politics. I focus on policy and try to do things in a nonpartisan way. The subcommittee that I led on entrepreneurship, also Sheryl Sandberg of Facebook and John Doerr, a venture investor, Kleiner Perkins, were part of that effort. It led to some initiatives, including one that passed Congress, some legislation called the Jobs Act, the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, passed about 4 years ago. That legalized crowdfunding and use of the internet so entrepreneurs can raise capital for their company, really important in these rise of the rest regions where there aren't venture capitalists. So using the internet to get some of that initial money to get started is can be a real game changer. Also made it easier for young companies to go public. Some of the rules around what they called Sarbanes-Oxley were pretty onerous for small companies, and so the Jobs Act changed some of that. So I think there are examples of some progress. There are always challenges with the government, but I think if you get the right number of people focused on the right issues and working together in at least a bipartisan, hopefully nonpartisan way, I think we can move things forward. I think in that instance, I give the White House credit and the Congress credit for coming together, even though 4 years ago it was another tough election year, to pass legislation that would help entrepreneurs all over the country.
Do you think it's important to help get funding for startups to make it easier to democratize it, the Kickstarter, et cetera?
Yeah, I think because the capital right now is focused on a few places. If you're an entrepreneur in another place, you don't really have the same opportunity. Also, if last year 90% of capital went to men, only 10% to women, so they really don't have a level playing field. People of color don't have the same opportunity. So how do we make sure, irrespective of whether you're in Silicon Valley or Detroit or Des Moines, and irrespective of you're a man or woman, or irrespective of you're white or black or what have you, that if you have a great idea, you have a shot. You have a shot at the American dream. You have a shot at creating a company that can create jobs and lift up your community. I think that's got to be a big push going forward, and it's going to be important, particularly in this third wave, because the innovation is going to happen all across the country, and we need to make sure everybody with ideas is on the playing field.
On a personal basis, you've obviously got this innate ability to persevere through stuff. It's interesting. You said at one point you were the number one Vanity Fair, I think, media person ahead of Gates, Buffett, Jobs, and then you were off the list completely. You had this visionary look at the online community long before it was accepted. You didn't get into business school over it. What is giving you the ability to persevere under big setbacks?
I don't know. I just think I like challenges, and sometimes I like being, people in the early days, nobody believed in the idea of the internet. Nobody believed in AOL. So just kind of persevering and sticking with it because I was passionate about the idea, and kind of take some, it's sometimes fun to prove the skeptics wrong. I think that's sort of a dynamic, and I think I've always been pretty resilient. I think even when AOL was kind of at its peak, I used to say I was sort of the shock absorber of the company, trying to when things were hot, trying to kind of make sure people didn't get cocky. I used to call that delegating paranoia. And when things were down, because there's some challenges like Microsoft trying to crush us or other things, kind of remind people why we're competitively advantaged and why this is a battle worth fighting. So I think I've always had that mentality. I think it's served me well, because there are, like any career, any life, there's always going to be some ups and downs. And I certainly learned that sometimes these revolutions happen in evolutionary ways. And if you don't persevere, you don't kind of stick with it, then you're not going to be there when the sky kind of opens up and the sun starts shining.
Tell us what the Case Foundation is all about, and what is impact investing?
We launched the Case Foundation nearly 20 years ago. My wife, Jean, runs it as CEO, and we've done a number of things over the past 2 decades. And one focus right now is on inclusive entrepreneurship. How do we level the playing field? Another, as you mentioned, is impact investing, this idea that the next generation of companies won't just focus on profit. They'll also focus on purpose. They'll measure their impact. And there's a concept that emerged in the last few years called benefit corporations, or B Corps. And now there's several thousand corporations that have been registered as B Corps, which basically means that their governance, their boards are chartered with taking a longer-term view and focusing on how they're going to have impact. And there's a lot of different ways to measure the impact, but the companies who are part of this impact investment movement basically spell out exactly what they're going to do in addition to profit. Obviously, the profits have to be there, otherwise the company's not going to be successful, not going to be sustainable. But more and more people, particularly young people and millennials, want to work for companies or do business with companies or invest in companies that stand for more than profits. They also do have a purpose. So I think impact investing will be one of the key themes in this third wave, along with this notion of the rise of the rest, regional entrepreneurship. And each of these things are happening sort of separately, but as they converge, it's really going to accelerate. The third wave is going to accelerate the rise of the rest and accelerate the growth of impact investing. I think that will result in a stronger country. Wow,
what an ed. We've covered a lot of ground. Thanks to Steve Case, The Third Wave, An Entrepreneur's Vision of the Future, just out, published by Simon and Schuster. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Podcast available at iTunes. Search Business Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll be back next week. Thanks to our national audience for listening. Thanks again to Steve. See you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.
This is John Iannuzzi, producer of Biz Talk with Jim Campbell. In this week's Segment 5 Overtime, exclusively for Yale Radio WIBC, we go back to Omaha for the Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting weekend of festivities. One of the highlights for those attending the annual event in Nebraska is a reception hosted by Borsheim's Fine Jewelry, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway since 1989. Thousands gather at the store's open house for refreshments, commemorative items, and jewelry sold to shareholders at deep discounts. This year, Jim Campbell spoke with Borsheim's Director of Marketing, Adrian Fay. After that, it's an unedited, full-length presentation of our interview with Tom Gaynor, co-chief executive officer of Markel Corporation. He's been touted as the next Buffett, and he discusses building the next Berkshire Hathaway. But first, here's Jim's interview with Adrian Fay at Borsheim's Fine Jewelry in Omaha.
And we are back in Omaha here for the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting at always one of the biggest events of all, which is the reception on Friday night at Borsheim's, a upscale jeweler that Mr. Buffett bought, right?
That's right.
Tell us about the event. How many folks are here?
Absolutely. So we will see about 10,000 people through our doors today. Last year we saw 27,000 shareholders come through Borsheim's over the 3-day period.
Mind-boggling. Give us a sense, as I've seen here, on the kind of stuff that you guys actually, before we talk about the merchandise side.
Absolutely. So we have our event hosts shareholders from around the globe. We'll see people here internationally and domestically. We've got an amazing buffet and food and beverage for everyone. So it's quite the party. And for us, we like to make connections with our shareholders in this way. We like to get to know them. We like to thank them for coming, thank them for being part of the weekend, and hopefully that thanks will turn into sales down the road.
In fact, let's just give some of these stats quickly. As you said, 27,000 shareholders last year, and they hope to do that by the end of the weekend. Processing a credit card transaction every 11 seconds, feeding the folks here 25,000 meatballs, 1,000 pounds of cheese, 800 pounds of vegetables. And what about these 40 diamonds with Warren Buffett's signature that range from 4,000 to 220,000? We're trying to figure out what that looks like. How do they get his signature inside of it?
So on the diamond itself, on the girdle, the perimeter around the diamond is laser inscribed with Mr. Buffett's signature. And you have to see it under about 20 magnification, but it's pretty amazing. And
it looks nice?
It looks very nice. And so we've got these 40 diamonds. We have a microscope and a TV screen so shareholders can see the signature on the diamond as they're perusing them. We've had 40. I think 13 are already sold already.
Wow.
So
and he's actually signed this somehow?
It is his signature that he has signed, but then laser engraved. So he can't sign each of them, but we do take his signature and then inscribe it on that diamond.
Now, how much business do you expect to do?
Quite a bit. For us, we call this our Christmas in May. It's as significant as the Christmas selling season for us.
Is the discount significant for the shareholders?
We like to think this is the best price of the whole year for shareholders. Borsheim's is a value-based store, so every day you'll see the retail price and then the Borsheim's price, which is a discount. This is now an even further discount.
And do you guys do a lot of internet business?
We do.
So you're way outside of Omaha.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. So we're here in Omaha. About 46% of our customers are outside the state of Nebraska. So we're doing a lot through the internet, but also phone and doing those over-the-phone sales for out-of-market shareholders.
So what does the director of marketing do with it?
I do a lot. I oversee. I oversee our marketing team, but I also oversee our business sales team, which is a small business-to-business side of our arm. But we do everything from our visual and print marketing, our catalogs, to our e-commerce campaigns and our pay-per-click, to service award programs for local and national businesses as well. So I wear a lot of different hats, and that's sort of the nature of Borsheim's. We've got people who wear lots of different hats because we're a pretty flat organization.
Now, the fact that you're in Omaha, does that mean that you see more of Warren? He's more hands-on. How does he interact with you folks?
We're lucky as one of the local subsidiaries that we do see him. He comes into the store. He shops during Christmas. I have come out of the bathroom at my office sometimes and had seen him. It's he certainly isn't an everyday or even every month presence, but he's around and he's always there. I know my boss, our CEO, if she needs him, he is always there. He always takes her call. He will always talk to anyone that has the questions for him.
Tell us a little bit about your CEO.
She's an amazing woman. She is grown up at Borsheim, so it was her first job out of college.
Oh.
She was our director of merchandising for many, many years, which is Berkshire's largest capital investment in our business. So you think that when their dollars go to support our business, the inventory is one of those biggest assets. So she had managed that asset. She actually stepped away for about 6 years to raise her kids. So she went back and was a stay-at-home mom, and then came back and became CEO. So she's got a pretty amazing trajectory.
All right, now tell us about Sunday, because you got the brunch here and some exciting, cool stuff going on.
That's right. It's a festival. It's a field day practically here. So starting at 1 p.m., we'll have table tennis in the center court with national champion and Olympic hopeful Ariel Singh. She played in the London Olympics, and she's likely going to compete in the Rio Olympics.
She's like 14 or something?
You know, she started coming here when she was 9, and she's now a sophomore in college, and she is an amazingly accomplished woman.
And Buffett steps up against her?
He does, and he plays a few hands. No one lasts long against Ariel, but but she's a pretty amazing, and he plays a few rounds with her. We'll have bridge as well. Bridge is one of our mainstays, and we have national bridge players Sharon Osberg and Bob Hammond that come and play with shareholders.
And just out here in the...
Actually, we'll go upstairs. This out in our mall will be table tennis, and then upstairs we do a bridge setup. And then Mr. Buffett says he'll stop by around 1 p.m. and maybe partake in some of these games. We also have a magician Norman Beck also comes and performs a small show. So,
and I'm told that Bill Gates also in the bridge area.
Typically, we see when Mr. Gates does come, he likes to sit down and play bridge for a bit of time.
Wow. Anything else you'd like to tell us about this great event?
We also do special merchandise for the event itself, and we're one of the few retailers that will have in the Berkshire companies Berkshire-themed merchandise. So for us, that may be as small as a $15 sparkle pen that has filled with crystals, that has Warren's signature on the barrel of the pen. It may be what I'm wearing now, which is a Roberto Coin, an Italian designer, disc pendant that says BRK in diamonds. So we have sort of soup to nuts everything. We also have a Riedel crystal Coke glasses to optimize your Coke, because we know that Mr. Buffett loves his Coca-Cola.
Oh, yes.
So we've got a set of 2 Warren and Charlie engraved crystal Coke glasses as well. So
are you wearing some Borsheim's jewelry?
I am. I've got the BRK pendant
looks
on.
Great.
So yeah, so we do a great selection of merchandise that proves to be popular with shareholders every year.
Tell us, when did he buy this?
In 1989, and then we hosted the first cocktail party in 1990.
Is that right?
And it's grown a whole gob since then.
What was the size then versus now?
So our size of the crowds was dramatically smaller. When we hosted this first cocktail party, maybe 50 people. I mean, it really, yeah. And then at that point, the annual meeting was on a Sunday, and so then we did the meeting, we did the party beforehand. I mean, everything was just so much dramatically smaller, and it's just gotten big. The folksy and homegrown side of it still holds true, but it's just the size and scale is huge. This is my 13th Berkshire. It's even so much bigger than 13 years ago.
Well, thank you very much. We've been talking with Adrienne Fay. She's Director of Marketing at Borsheim's. Always hosts at least a couple of the biggest events, the brunch on Sunday and the reception now, which is 6 till 9. And you go through one heck of a lot of food.
A whole lot of food. All that ranch dressing, 300 pounds of ranch dressing.
That's a good way to end it. Thank you, Adrienne. And this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated on the Biz Talk Radio Network, over 350 stations around the country. And again, from the lobby of the Hilton Omaha, we're very honored to be with Tom Gaynor. He's the co-chief executive officer of Markel Corporation, often viewed as a baby Berkshire or a next generation Buffett. I've asked you this before, Tom, but I'm going to ask it again and then with a twist to it, which is when you're compared to basically the Babe Ruth of the investment world, Warren Buffett and Berkshire, what kind of a burden is it? Now, you've said you've been able to handle it and you don't mind it, but let me ask it in the context, do you have some twists that you think are Tom Gaynor only that maybe you don't get as much credit for if you're lumped in as the next Buffett? How do you think about that, both the burden and Tom Gaynor?
Well, sure. Well, A, it's a very flattering comparison, so how can you not be anything but flattered when somebody says something like that? Now, B, the most important thing is you have to be yourself and you have to figure out your own ways of doing things, but Buffett has been a tremendous teacher and exemplar of how to do things. He's laid out the playbook publicly of the way he thinks about things, the way he thinks about his business, the way he thinks about investments for years and years and years, and he's been the most successful guy in the world at doing it. So why wouldn't you study him and try to be as much like him as possible? Yeah, but if you were a baseball player, you might want to hit home runs like Babe Ruth. I think I could be accused more of eating hot dogs like Babe Ruth than in hitting home runs. But he's clearly the best at what he's done, so you try to be as much like him as one can.
And I might say you've actually beaten him for a while, obviously on a smaller base, 21% compounded since 1986, and you know that's pretty impressive. How long have you been coming to these meetings? You've owned Berkshire is what kind of a chunk of your portfolio?
Yeah, Berkshire is slightly over 10% of our portfolio. It's our largest single holding, and it was the first stock we ever purchased for the Markel portfolio when I joined the company in 1990. And I started coming in 1991. The the first annual meeting they had. So this is year number 26 in a row. Haven't missed one since that first time.
I asked this of Tom Russo because his portfolio is about 10% Berkshire as well. Berkshire, obviously, on that base is growing less than both his fund and Markel's been growing. Is it value destructive?
No, I wouldn't call it that at all. Now, clearly, as Buffett laid out, and I'll try to be brief, but back in 91, when I first came here, Buffett talked about, at that point, he felt they were so large and they had done well that there was no way they could possibly do that well going forward. And I thought, oh, no, I just bought the stock. I just showed up. And here it is 26 years later. Berkshire's had a tremendous, spectacular run since that time. He declaims the ability to keep going every single year in a modest and humble way, but this is a company that creates immense value year in and year out, and I think it'll continue to do so.
And it's a forever holding?
Well, I'm not a forever person.
Yeah.
I'm 54 years old, and as a comedian said, once you're in your 50s, you sort of have to admit that life is probably at least a third over. So
I just turned 60, Tom, so you're getting close to home here. By the way, I'll say one of the folks we interviewed, Robert Call, we interviewed him on John Malone, actually. But he turns out, I did not know this, to have worked at Markel in the tax department.
That's right, in the Chicago office. I do remember him, yes.
And he said that probably the greatest compliment you could pay somebody, he said that your kids are incredibly well behaved.
Thank you.
That is, as a father of 4 girls, that means something. Tell us what briefly is the Markel story and how you look at creating value. I know you have it in buckets.
Sure. Well, Markel in and of itself is a specialty insurance-based company. That's what we did, and largely exclusively that until the year 2005. We have over 100 different product lines of sort of nooks and crannies in the insurance business, where we're doing things like children's summer camps in remote areas, or oil rigs out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico or the North Sea, or classic cars, old boats, art collections, all sorts of different sort of things. We've been profitable in that business, and similar to the Berkshire model, basically we've taken the profits that we generate in the insurance business and invest them longer term in a portfolio of equity securities, publicly traded, and since 2005 with Markel Ventures, a set of controlled businesses that we own controlling interest in.
Do you are you relying on float as well as it's a big part of the strategy?
Absolutely, and any insurance company does. That's the nature of the business. Insurance is something that the client pays for it up front and collects later on. So
you guys have been managed to have positive float as well.
Well, yes,
you're getting paid to use the money.
Right. That's the cost of float that you're speaking of.
Yes.
So yes, any and every insurance company has float. The interesting question is, how much does it cost?
And most of them, it's negative. And they just hope the investment, exceeds the negativity.
Right.
Markel style. I looked in your annual report. That's how you refer to your culture. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it was the way that prior to Markel going public in 1986, our chairman, Alan Kirshner, Steve Markel, who's a vice chairman these days, Tony Markel, who's a vice chairman, but the three of them really ran the company as a triumvirate for a long time, for a couple of decades. And prior to going public, they wanted to create a document and create a mission statement that they would have confidence would live after them. Mm-hmm. So for Richie Witt and myself and Mike Crowley, who are sort of the triumvirate running the show these days, we have the Markel style to fall back on, as do the 10,000 people of Markel to act as a guidepost to see the ways in which we should operate and the values that we should hold the highest in the company. And that's what the Markel style is all about.
All right. You're about 10% the size of Berkshire. Are you guys, in your mind, at an inflection point where you're going to begin to, for instance, Markel Ventures, I saw, has reached the $1 billion level, where controlled ownership of companies is going to become closer to the Berkshire model? The mix of equities is going to become, closer to the Berkshire model. Is that the runway that you're on?
Well, that would be the path, and it's not a matter of conscious plan or specific targets. It's a matter of going to work every day and looking at the opportunities that are out there and trying to pick the best ones and do what's logical. Now, over time, what that has meant is that we've owned more stocks than we used to, more equities. Over time, that's meant that we've owned more in the way of controlled businesses through Markel Ventures than we had before. I would think and expect and hope that going forward, that will continue to be a bigger and bigger number. But it's
Which
not
should
the
drive your returns up.
Well, that's the goal, and that's the plan. That's the way it has worked out so far. But it's not. There are not specific goals that we have that we're trying to meet. It's more a matter of being opportunistic and reacting to opportunities we see out there in the marketplace.
What's the benchmark that you're measuring yourself by, or your goals, or growth and intrinsic value per share, whatever? What is it?
Yeah, the benchmark really is doing the best you can and giving it your all, and not holding yourself to specific numerical numbers too often, because I think oftentimes people will end up behaving unnaturally if they have an unnatural goal. So there's nothing magic about saying 12% or 15% or 9% or 18%. In different environments with different set of opportunities, sometimes a 9% number is just going to be absolutely fantastic when you look at a year. Sometimes a 14% is not going to look so great. So it depends on the environment you're in. But if you did the best you could, then you should be happy and put your head on your pillow at night saying, job well done. And that's really what we try to do.
You know, it's funny. You just reminded me. Bill Parcells used to say that there was a year where 5-11, for instance, in a turnaround might have been a better coaching job than a 10-6,
right?
Which might have been 12.
I would agree with that spectacularly. And one of my heroes is John Wooden. And John Wooden, on retiring,
pyramid,
well, among other things, but he was asked about the 10 national championships and the winning streak and things like that. And he responded to the reporter, said, the truth is I never really thought about it. And the reporter found that hard to believe. But what Wooden said was, look, my job was to do the best I could and help my players play the best they can. And if they did that, there was no score that could make them a loser. And if they didn't do that, there was no score that could make them a winner. So that's the mentality that I...
Now, the Markel structure, where in Berkshire he's the capital allocator, he's the chairman, he's the chief executive. That's obviously going to change once the succession's in place. But you guys, you're run by the insurance sector, and you have essentially the investment sector, right? I mean, it's a different structure than the way...
Actually, it would be relatively similar. Now, Richie Witt and myself, who are the co-chief executives these days, the realm of responsibility that each of us have is, at the end of the day, somebody has to have the ultimate responsibility. That role cannot really be shared. So on the matters of insurance, Richie Witt is where the buck stops. On matters of investments and the venture stuff, the buck stops with me. Now, Richie and I have worked together every day for about 25 years. Our offices are within feet of one another. We talk all the time, so we have a pretty close relationship. But we do divert to one another.
Is he like a Charlie Munger to you in some ways?
We both try to serve. You're not going to be exactly like anybody else. I think it's great to have partners who are smart, who will speak candidly to you and tell you the truth, and that you're willing to hear bad news from. And Richie serves that role for me, and I hope that I serve that role for him as well.
Are you, when we talk about being compared to Babe Ruth, are you driven to be the best, to surpass that, or it's more of an internal what's best?
It's completely internal. I can remember my mother and her technique of raising a child. Sometimes you'd come home and you'd get a 97 on a test or a 94 or something like that, and you'd have an A and you'd be real proud of it. But she would always say, Tommy, did you do the best you could do? That was the question she always asked me.
And that's a tough thing,
That's a tough question, exactly. But that's what motivates me, to do the best I can. If I do that, I'm happy. If I don't, I'm not.
Sounds like you tap dance to work, too, like the other guy, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
What's your circle of competence that you feel comfortable with? I use the sugar money dirt kind of thing?
I've joked about that over the years. So if you look at most of what we invest in, it either something from sugar, because sugar you can turn into chocolate or whiskey or food that tastes good, and that's an enduring good thing to have. So we look a lot at that. Money or financial institutions, referred to as the world's second oldest business, financial intermediation of some form or fashion, whether that's insurance, banking, brokerage, things like that. Dirt, I joke about that, like real estate or aggregates or things that would have pretty specific cash flows associated with those businesses that you don't have to guess a lot about or make wild assumptions in the future. You have a pretty tight range of precision.
Are
when
you
you're
still
looking
big
at
on carbacks?
Yes, I am. I think it's a fine business and it's a well-run business.
And we have two in our family. All right, last question, Tom, and once again, thanks for your time. What would you like to see Markel look like 20 years from now?
Better.
Bigger? Much bigger?
I think it would be bigger. If we are better, odds are it will be bigger as well. But the most important thing is that it be better, that we're serving more people, taking care of more people, having more products and services that people are happy with. And if we do that, the company will be bigger as a result.
And that's how you define better.
That's correct.
Is that from an insurance perspective, product side?
Both.
Both in that and on what do you intend to buy more and more and bigger companies from Markel Ventures?
That would be what we would hope to do, yes.
So it's all about that you're on a runway with a lot of room to go.
That's right.
And you're going to get it done, right?
We'll do the best we can.
All right. I always love having Tom Gaynor on. He's one of the superstars coming up. Maybe 10% of Berkshire, but perhaps the best baby Berkshire that's out there right now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom, for your time.